This is the Business Storytelling Show with Christoph Trapp. Name a top 20 storytelling podcast and a top 5% podcast globally. Christoph chats with thought leaders and experts to share tips and tricks that can help you tell your company's stories better to drive business results. Available wherever you listen to podcasts, live streamed on major social media channels, and part of the DB&A television network. Available on most U.S. television sets and streaming on Roku and Amazon Fire. Here's Christoph with today's episode. Let's go.
Hey, business storytellers. How's everyone doing? Fist bump. Let's get today's episode going. And we want to talk about accessibility. Now, this is one of those topics. Why do we have to keep talking about this? Seriously, your website should be accessible. Everything should be accessible. Now, you might see my glasses if you're watching on video or Spotify. Spotify, by the way, has the video podcast version now, so you can just watch it in the app directly. That's relatively new. But I wear glasses, and I can't see very well. So you know what I use? I zoom way in on all my phones and everything, and some apps can't handle it. You know what they do? They zoom in, and you can't see anything. The text is all crunched together. I don't know if that's actually an accessibility issue or how we would categorize that, but we will ask today's guest and expert, Stacey Turmell. She's a chief digital accessibility expert. I heard her on Christina Potnar's show a few weeks ago. Christina was on the show at least once, maybe even twice, and we talked about digital policy. But I wanted Stacey to come on the show. She graciously agreed with me. My first question for her is, what I just mentioned, is that accessibility, or how do we categorize that? Stacey, welcome.
Hi, Christoph. Thank you so much for having me join you.
So tell me, when I'm trying to zoom in, I turn the zoom on, but it just crunches everything together. Is that accessibility, or is that just bad design, or what is that?
I think it would be a combination of both, quite honestly. What you've identified is a common issue on both websites and mobile apps under something that's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which set forth what are recommended guidelines to have an accessible website. There is something called, the ability to zoom into content just for your point. I mean, for me, I'm generally looking at my screen at 125 to 150%. But under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we should be able to zoom in up to 400% and make sure that the content is still readable, is still understandable, and that we don't have to engage in what is called two-dimensional scrolling, which is, you've probably seen it before, where you have to scroll both sideways and up and down in order to see all the content.
Yeah. No, Mike. No. And that is still a thing today in 2022.
Yes. Oh, yes, it is.
I mean, I don't even know where to go with this conversation. So why is this still an issue today? And some of this, I mean, let's be clear. If somebody says, "Well, accessibility doesn't affect me as a consumer," but the example you just gave, I think that even that affects everybody, whether they have they can't see very well or whatever it might be. I mean, some of these things, they're just an annoyance to everybody.
I completely agree with you. And I find it interesting when we have the conversation and we use the word accessibility, because certain groups and businesses, they hear the word accessibility and they're just like, I don't want to have to deal with that. But what we're really talking about is website usability. And so it's interesting when we talk about user experience and website usability, how all of a sudden, we're open arms and so approachable, and we want to make sure that our website is usable. Well, it should be usable by everybody, everybody of different abilities. But for whatever reason, the word accessibility comes up, and we just want to push it aside and not necessarily want to listen to it. Or I could talk about the aging population. Again, open arms and very welcoming, but accessibility, no thank you. So it is an issue. And I think it's because it's perceived by different organizations, different businesses, as a cost, as an obligation, as a I don't want to have to do this, please don't tell me what to do type situation. Where what we usually find when we're designing under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and utilizing those as a benchmark for improved web design is a lot of the recommendations, if not all of the recommendations that they provide, actually make the website easier to use for everybody. I mean, just like the example we just used, I don't want to engage in two-dimensional scrolling. And guess what? If I'm filling out a form on a website and I think that I've filled it out satisfactorily, another accessibility guideline is if I've made a mistake, you tell me what my mistake is. I don't know about you, Christoph, but how many times do you want to fill out a form on a website and still not be able to understand what the problem is before you move on to something else? I mean, we don't have the patience or the time, and I don't know about you, but I'm going to be moving on to somebody else who might provide that product or service.
I mean, I do. I mean, even if it's a relatively important form, but if it's somewhat voluntary, you know what I mean? If it's not like the government or somebody like that, but government websites, I mean, they certainly, many of them have a ways to go as well. So you mentioned, so first of all, I'm not sure. So I got things zoomed in on my screens, right? And then I still zoom in on the browser, right? So whatever that is, but I'm definitely not to 400%. I would go out on a limb here and say that I'm not so sure I've ever visited a website where I could zoom in 400%. I don't know if that's a thing. I mean, is that really a thing? Do you have an example top of your mind where somebody has actually achieved that, where you can still read it when you zoomed in 400%?
I mean, I think it would depend on the type of website. And the reason why I say that is because, a lot of the websites these days, especially e-commerce websites, they add in at the beginning coupons, they have the cookie banner. And a lot of these third-party plugins, if you will, or third-party resources that are being utilized on a website are operating within a fixed amount of space, and they aren't necessarily operating seamlessly with the website that they're placed on, if that makes sense. So if there's a coupon that's coming across the screen and you're blowing up that website 400%, a lot of times what we see happen is the whole screen's the coupon and you can't find out anything else that's going on in that website. And people who have low vision are going to be blowing up their screen more than just 150% and maybe all the way up to that 400% size limit that we're just talking about. Also, aging population will be blowing up their screen too. The same with the cookie banner on the bottom. And so I think that can be an issue that's very problematic. And you want to make sure that users can access all the content on the screen. And again, if you're having to scroll from here to eternity to try to get that information, you become much less patient and tolerant about being able to get that information. So it's important for businesses and organizations, anybody with a website, to test it not only, in just a regular environment, but also we see these problems a lot in a mobile environment too.
Yeah. And I mean, the testing is a whole different discussion, honestly, because there's so many different devices, which is why in my opinion, you just have to follow best practices. And I'll give you an example. I went from the Authentic Storytelling Project to ChristophTrapp.com. Back in the day, it made sense to have that site. But when it was moved over, the agency that did it, the Gazette Company in Cedar Rapids, everything was done correctly, the way you're supposed to do it. So there was no SEO loss. Nothing was lost, right? It's just like flipping the switch. So my point is, they did it by the book. And you really just have to do everything by the book, right? This is how you design a responsive website. Here's how it works with usability in mind and accessibility. Now, earlier you mentioned something like some people go, oh, we don't want to deal with that. But do people have a choice? Like you don't have to have a site if there's a standard that you have. I mean, I see lawsuits coming up every once in a while, right? I mean, is that not, there's some requirement or not?
Actually, one of the areas that I spend a lot of time, providing presentations on for continuing legal education is the just incredible exponential increase in the lawsuits that has gone on since 2017. Right now, we're at a point where website accessibility lawsuits are being filed at the rate of 1 per hour in a working day. So you're seeing just huge increases. I think that what is there's a couple of different things based on what you mentioned. One is there a hard and fast rule? And the answer is no. There's no hard and fast rule that says this is what you're supposed to do with your website in order to make it accessible. So what has happened is it's, some states will say it falls under, the ADA and what's called a public accommodation business, and how those businesses are regulated under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some states follow what is called the viewpoint that a standalone website must be accessible. And some states follow what's called a nexus theory, which is that if your website is tied to a brick and mortar organization business, then your website must be accessible. The federal government requires its own websites to be accessible under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So what has happened is, because it's basically a free-for-all out there is the best way to describe it, is we're seeing what we call serial plaintiffs who are just machine generating demand letters to businesses, and some going so far as suing businesses to the extent that I previously described. And and because businesses are just kind of like, what is happening? I'm not sure what to do about this. We're seeing just a huge increase in businesses that are being blindsided to a certain extent. And we're looking to the case law that is being developed as a result of these lawsuits that actually make it through into the courts and are litigated in order to tell us what we should be doing, what businesses should be doing in order to make their websites accessible. And so what's come out of that case law is references to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, although that has not been specifically codified in any particular statute. There's a bipartisan bill that's been put forth to Congress saying, let's add another section to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's getting, support, and, there's frustration on both sides of what's to be included in it. But at the end of the day, I cannot point you to a hard and fast rule that's going to tell you exactly what to do.
Oh my goodness. So nothing is ever easy. I mean, we can say that about many different things, but how do so if I'm updating a website or building a website, some companies are even struggling just talking about good usability. I mean, don't get me going on sliders on a homepage. I've yet to see why sliders are necessary on any homepage. I don't care if you're a newspaper. I mean, not even the New York Times has a slider, I don't think. But, you don't need it. Nobody sits there and goes, ooh, I need this to be moving on its own, right? It's an ego thing. So some companies can't even overcome that barrier. How do we build in the accessibility discussion if there isn't even a law, or if there isn't even there has to be some guidelines, right? I assume. How do we tie that in, and how do we build that into our usability and just kind of make it part of the plan? And does it now I'm throwing 8 questions at you, and how much more, if it even costs more? Does it cost more? Is there more involved than just going through the process and building a good website?
Well, the shortest answer to that question is, does it cost more? And the answer would be, it's going to cost a lot less than a lawsuit. I'm going to be completely candid with you. It's going to cost a lot less than hiring a law firm to litigate that issue for you. Of course, it's always upsetting and disappointing when you have an organization that's just like, I just finished the rebuild and now you're telling me I have to redo it. I mean, to some organizations that's heartbreaking when they pour their heart and soul into something and then to find out that it's not accessible. So the best thing to do is to bake in accessibility from the beginning. So whether you're coming at it from a proactive standpoint, which is this is something that's part of our core mission and values, and we want to make sure that we reach the widest audience possible, which is always a business growth mindset and a really good idea, then bake accessibility in from the beginning and seek out an expert that can help you. I talk about this with dealing with vendors who are promising accessibility. Make sure they're actually living up to what their promises are. Is it accessible? How are they testing it? How are they verifying it? So that's a proactive standpoint. A reactive standpoint is, I've received a demand letter. Oh my gosh, what is this? I need to do something. Again, seek out expert assistance to make sure that whatever fixes you're going to implement are accurate. I mean, I've worked with organizations that have received one demand letter. They think they've engaged in a process to fix it, just to turn around and receive more demand letters just because one person sued you and you believe that you fixed it, but you didn't have that verified, doesn't mean everybody else couldn't line up to sue you either. So to try to minimize those risks for any business or organization, which are just costs that they're going to have to absorb, because at the end of the day, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the plaintiff isn't walking away with a big bucket of cash or anything. What they're entitled to is their attorney's fees, which can ratchet up rather quickly. And they're also entitled to injunctive relief, which is generally what we find in the form with websites of remediation, meaning you're going to have to fix it. So if you know that now, because I'm sharing that with you now, then start moving on that, now versus getting a demand letter, paying a law firm, and then having to remediate, because eventually it's going to have to be taken care of. And then we can talk about the issue of, well, let me just sign up for something I've seen on the internet that has promised me that for, some small amount of money per month, I can make all my accessibility worries go away with this quick one line of code fix. And quick fixes are not the answer. If anything, what happens is quick fixes will actually tee you up for being a target for another lawsuit, because what's been determined is that these automated resolutions that are out there are really not making your website accessible and actually can make it worse. And there are groups of plaintiffs who will go out to those organizations to see who the trusted partners are or the client base is, and they'll look at you for sending out another demand letter because they know that the website is not accessible. So Christoph, just a ton of different things. I know it's a lot of information I've just kind of pushed out at you, but it's a lot, to consider, a lot to think about.
A lot to think about for sure. It's also interesting to know that the plaintiffs, they're not necessarily in it for the money, because they're not going to end up with, that bucket of money if they sue you. They just wanted to get it fixed. Now, the lawyers, of course, they have a decent payday there quickly. The internetisforeveryone.com is where you can connect with Stacey, so check that out. Now, I think the one question, sometimes I start with this one, I don't think I did, but what does an accessible website, what does that entail? What functions does it have, or how do you know is it just that you're able to zoom in? We already talked about that, I think, at length, that a screen reader can read it. What else is there?
Well, you've heard me mention several times during our discussion today about the web content accessibility guidelines. And right now we're dealing with the WebCon accessibility guidelines version 2.1 is the most current version. And there are 78 testable criteria under the web content accessibility guidelines for which you can have your website tested to see how accessible it is. But just to give you some general ideas and some what I call just general tips for consideration. We talked about the zooming issue. Another thing to think about is that people who are blind aren't using a mouse. Okay, they're not going to know where the mouse is because they're blind. So they're going to be using the keyboard to navigate your website. So your website needs to be coded in a way and organized in a way that it makes sense and can be navigated using a keyboard through either the tab keys or the arrow keys. And that's what we call keyboard accessibility. Another tip would be, do your images on your website have alt text? Some organizations are just like, oh, how tedious, what a pain. I have to add in a description of the images. Here's a wonderful opportunity for you to boost your SEO by adding more information about your organization, whether it's, through an image describing a product. If you want people to be able to purchase it, here's a great way to put more text about what's going on with your business out there on the internet. Make sure your images have alt text. Make sure that your headings are in order. I don't know about you, Christoph, but when I'm looking at a website, there are times if I'm scrolling forever and everything's looking the same, I'm wondering where I am, or if something was bigger and now smaller and then bigger again. Did I miss something? Make it predictable, make it understandable. We already talked about the form corrections and giving us error suggestions. That's important. Can you imagine if you were somebody who was with low vision or blind entering in confidential financial information? You'd want to have a level of confidence that that information is actually secure, so we need that information out there too. And just also not sticking somebody in a keyboard trap, which is where they can't get out of a certain area, or letting them know if they're going to be sent to another website. I don't know about you, but if I end up somewhere that wasn't my plan to begin with, it's frustrating, and I'm a sighted person. I couldn't even imagine what that would be like if I was somebody with low vision wondering where I am, and then that particular business or organization might lose me as a customer as a result of that. So I'm not going to go through all 78 testable criteria because I know we have limited time. And plus, I don't think anybody wants to hear about that at this point in time, but it certainly is something that you can take a look at. And if you're not sure, then hire an expert in order to help you to make sure that you're accessible.
At least, consider it and talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about. And I think that's something some of us sometimes undervalue, right? Like you have to get the expertise. I mean, if I had my dryer vent cleaned the other day, right? Same thing. I would never dream of doing that myself. I don't know how to go in there. I don't know where it all goes. I hired the expert. How is this any different? Just because we've all used websites before, that makes us accessibility experts? Absolutely not. So the alt text, really quickly, some of these things that you mentioned, they seem to be, if you don't do them already, for whatever reason, they're very short-term focused. So for example, if people don't put in alt text for your images, I would argue that's short-term focus, because your image should have a name anyways, wherever you store them, so you can find them later. If you only use them one time, you'll never find them anyways. So if you truly need a selfish reason, that's it right there. You'll never find it if you don't have a name. And then of course it does actually help you with SEO. So I don't know why you're not the first person who's ever mentioned alt tags on the show. I don't know why this keeps coming up. I mean, it's really not that difficult. How about like how text looks on the website? I mean, I sometimes see that, and this is maybe more on the usability side, even typography, but there is some websites, like in my eyes, are not the best, but they're also not the worst. I can't even read it. It's like the white text on black, and then it's like really low level. I mean, there's something to that too, is there not?
Oh, absolutely. You've identified actually two accessibility issues. One is color contrast, right? So gray on gray, not a good choice. I mean, nobody's going to see that. White on white, just like you mentioned, again, not a great choice. So color contrast, make the information stand out. You're only helping your users navigate and identify things more quickly. And then tiny text, who wants to try to figure that out? I mean, that's not an enjoyable experience. So make sure that it's easily readable and that you're able to direct your audience to where you want them to go to get the information that you want to give them. The whole reason you have a website is I'm hoping, utilizing it as an asset for your business or organization to convey information and sell services or sell products. Well, make that easy for everybody. It actually helps you and your business. Also, another thing is, buttons super close together. I don't know about you, Christoph, but if I click something and it's not what I expected, but it's because it's on top of something else, that's frustrating. I have to go back and try to figure out where I was and try to navigate to the proper place. So don't, cluster things together. And although that's an accessibility requirement for people who might have mobility issues, Parkinson's or something, or they shake a little bit as a result of aging, it's also something that I want a lot of white space or just space around places where I'm supposed to navigate, so I know that I'm going to where I'm trying to select, and it's intentional and not being by default because, your website is a mess and I'm not sure what I'm doing.
Yeah, don't get me started on buttons too close to each other. The other thing, which I don't think is an accessibility issue, it's just being a little bit of a shady issue, quite frankly, is when people move buttons around and they put them where other buttons used to be, and now people click there by mistake because they thought that's where the button was that was there yesterday. Now, Stacey, we got about 1 minute here. I know people can work with you as a compliance consultant. Tell me about how does that look, and when would people reach out to you?
I work with different organizations and businesses, Christoph, in the area of website accessibility and accessibility compliance, and also in website remediation and compliance with settlement terms. So if an organization has been sued and they're complying with plaintiff settlement, requirement, then we work with organizations on that. If you want your website tested and analyzed to determine how accessible it is, we work with organizations on that too. And if you're looking for a risk mitigation protocol or training for your organization's team or policy implementation, I work with organizations on that also to help them, bolster their business and be more accessible and get more business.
Awesome. And they can connect with you on the internet is for everyone.com, correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. Stacey, thanks for making the time. Really appreciate it. We'll always learn a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Please rate and review our show on your favorite podcast channels. And don't forget to share this episode with your networks. We appreciate you. Until next time, let the best story